an original MCM production.
Thank you all for coming this evening, and great to be here. I'm going to try to take about half our time and do some readings from the book. I'll be reading dramatic scenes from the book that are taken from moments of running a college, an ambitious, high-achieving liberal arts college inside prison in New York. Really, we're active at 6 different prisons around the Hudson Valley in New York. And at the prison where most of these scenes are taken from, about 15% of that prison is a maximum security prison, are full-time barred college students working across the liberal arts and math and science and philosophy and politics and anthropology and German and Mandarin and computer science. Most of all of them dropped out in the 8th or 9th grade before being incarcerated, and they're thriving at one of the best and most challenging liberal arts colleges in the Northeast. About 15% of that prison is going to college full-time in that program, and that's one of 6 campuses that BARD has doing that work. And we're active in about 12 states around the country, helping other colleges and universities do something like-minded and something similar. Lots to talk about. I look forward to engaging in a conversation about that after I read some scenes from that. And one of them will be what are the limits of what this work really, what does this work tell us, perhaps, about mass incarceration? What role might it have to play in how we think or feel, or what our common sense is about the nature of this problem, and the limits of it, which are significant as an intervention or as part of the theme of this series as a whole, confronting mass incarceration as a phenomenon. So without any further ado, I will read. So the book is not a work of advocacy because it's hopefully messy and complicated, and I teach law in the humanities, and that allows me to sort of teach all over the map. And one of the, James Baldwin is one of the writers I find most privileged to teach and rewarding to teach and humbling to teach. And when I set out to write the book, I tried to live up to these following words of his in not writing a book of advocacy or policy reform. This is from an essay he wrote that many of you may have read called "Many Thousands Gone." And in that essay he writes, America, a country devoted to the death of paradox. Humbling, as I said, because what does that mean? You know, and as a teacher, you're supposed to sort of know what the authors mean who you share with your students. America, a country devoted to the death of paradox. I'll just say, one thing before I go further. I tried to write a book to live up to those lines, thinking I kind of sort of had figured out over the years what he meant, and knowing that I felt it was important. I tried to write a book that lived up to that, to not contribute to our national drive to kill paradox. Notice his language there, right? He doesn't say avoid paradox. He doesn't say solve paradox. He says kill it, murder it. So there's something about our human condition that he considers at stake in how we handle these questions and how we handle these issues. I guess one thing I could just throw out there is that, at our best, certainly among the folks maybe gathered here, we think of ourselves as problem solvers, right? We see something broken, we want to fix it. I think his words, if nothing else, give us pause. that we need to understand something before we can have the audacity to try to fix it, and that in trying to understand it, we ought to understand that in its humanity, it might be very difficult to solve. It might be a paradox, something that if we see its contradictions, will tell us something deeper about ourselves. So holding up to that standard, which I don't, I'll start to read. And what I thought I'll do is I'll open with part of the introduction, and then I'm going to read from 3 different moments, you might say in the life cycle of the college and the prison, a moment from the admissions process. Then I'll skip ahead to a moment at a graduation in prison. And then I'll share with you a scene or a moment that comes from a student's experience looking back after having graduated and after having left. So this is by way of an introduction. Prison should be a place where bad people are sent to suffer for the wrongs they've done to others. Our success in lowering crime has come through increased policing, harsher sentences, and expanded prisons. This toughness works, but it's also a sign of moral integrity. After the excesses of the 1960s and the failures of the welfare state, Americans have regained their nerve. We no longer tolerate whining about how criminals are the victims of circumstance or inequality or structural racism. Crime is down because punishment is up. The desire for revenge, which makes liberals cringe, is rooted in human nature and our religious traditions. Putting college in prison makes it seem that society, rather than individual men, are responsible for the crimes they have committed. It's a sign of moral weakness and of backsliding. College in prison is offensive. Mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. A college that enters prison systems becomes the handmaiden of something irredeemably corrupt. Out on the street, liberal arts colleges are bastions of class and racial privilege. When they step inside a prison to help a fraction of those confined there, they provide a fig leaf for a system that should instead be abolished. 1 in 3 African American men will spend part of their lives behind bars. An African American child born today is 6 times more likely to go to prison than the white child born a zip code next door. And African Americans are disproportionately stopped, arrested, and incarcerated in every state in the United States. Notoriously, it is said that California went so far as to plan future prison building by counting the numbers of poor children of color enrolled in its primary schools. The leaders of American systems of higher education are typically passive bystanders to the broader structural inequality of which mass incarceration is only a part. Colleges and universities that have failed to make American higher education adequately equal and accessible cannot absolve themselves by making gestures on behalf of a handful of those incarcerated. On entering the country's carceral factories, our privileged and largely white academic institutions can only serve to make the madness seem acceptable, reformable, reformed. To make matters worse, the implicit message of college and prison that hard work and individual discipline can make bad people better strengthens the logic of punishment and the illusion that American law is colorblind and fair. Under such conditions, the liberal arts college becomes a caricature, offering transformation to the wayward convict. Prisons, rather, along with the self-satisfied educational reformers within them, should be swept away. Okay, those are 3 different passages. Each of them paraphrases of things I hear all the time in this work. The celebration of the punitive turn and the return to traditional values, we're told, that justify the mass infliction of pain on those who have transgressed. The second, the critique that has fortunately swept much of the country, that in fact, in the contrary, mass incarceration is a form of what has been called the new Jim Crow. And the extended critique of the idea that college and prison can make a significant difference in that, especially in a country where access to this mode of education is an elite good. That 1% of Americans' college students go to private liberal arts colleges, 1%. Slightly larger percentage go to undergraduate colleges at our leading public institutions. So that's it. I have nothing to say to resolve that. Maybe we'll talk about that later. And I do that in the interests of, the voice, I hope, is sort of over my shoulder in the writing of the book that we began with. And each of them is partly true, is a piece of this puzzle. And we need to think about them before we try to solve the problem. Okay, a scene from an admissions process inside the prison. This actually is a scene from Indiana, where we've started a program with Notre Dame and Holy Cross College. It's now, I think it's 6th or 7th year. It's set at a medium security prison about halfway between South Bend and Hyde Park, south side of Chicago. It is not uncommon for us or one of our partner colleges to hold when we hold an admissions process inside the prison, and I can speak to the mechanics of that later if people are interested, to get about 100 or 120 applicants for 15 spots. There is no endowment to these programs. There is no public funding by and large, and there is no tuition charged. So we're small in part because we're committed to an elite mode of education. Small, intensive, enriched, extremely demanding, and partly because we have to raise all the money to pay for everything from scratch. Here's a scene from an admissions interview. Eligibility to apply is determined by simply having a high school equivalent, either a diploma or its equivalent. The vast majority of the applicants and admittees have a high school equivalency certificate and dropped out around the 9th grade, typically from the least performing school districts in their respective states. Here's a scene from an interview. Once they apply, they write an essay responding to a prompt that's like a college text. They write for an hour and a half, and then about 3, 4, or 5 faculty members will read each essay and invite 40 or some authors for an interview. Here's a scene from one of those interviews. The story of, right. Mr. Smith wore glasses and had a small reddish-brown goatee and numerous tattoos. He was from the Appalachian region of southern Indiana along the Kentucky border, but was incarcerated in northern Indiana in the post-industrial stretch east of Chicago and Gary. He applied to a college program based at Notre Dame, which we were helping to start, and I was out there assisting with the first admissions process, as my academic colleagues learned the ropes. Mr. Smith had dropped out of school after the 10th grade, but his admissions essay, a response to an excerpt about the economic interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, which if you're of a certain age, you may have read by Charles and Mary Beard, which I can't resist. When it came out, it was a book that argued that constitutional policy was informed, the writing of the Constitution and by the Federalists was informed by the interests of the creditors who had lent money to the Patriots during the War of Independence, and that the state needed to be shored up to make good on their credit, a sort of a critique of sort of the Hamiltonian moment, you might say. And when it came out, Woodrow Wilson was still a history professor at Princeton, and his review of the Beard's book was on this called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution was, scavengers hyena-like desecrate the graves of dead patriots whom we revere. I love taking that swipe at Wilson as an academic review. It was the first really sort of work of critical history on the U.S. Constitution, so it actually functions in some of the classes that I sometimes teach. Okay, so his college essay had been a response to a brief excerpt from this book, a 1920s progressive era reading of the U.S. Constitution. It had scored among the highest in the group. He had been unanimously invited for an interview, but the conversation was going poorly. He was guarded and seemed deeply suspicious. I encouraged him by saying that his essay had been quite impressive and asked him if he read a lot. No, he said, he did not. What about writing, I asked. It seems you must write regularly. I don't write at all, he answered stoically. Never a short story, or a poem, or a song, anything like that? No. Letters, then. Surely you write letters. No. I was at a loss, and desperate. What about a journal? Do you keep a journal? After a short pause, he said, I keep 2 journals. 2? Well, then, so it's not essays or letters or what you might have thought I meant by college-type writing, but it seems as if you do a lot of writing, I answered. Good writing. But did you say 2 journals? He continued after a pause. At the end of every day in here, I sit in my cell and write down what happened on that day. Sometimes there's something in particular I want to write about, what I thought about something that happened. Mostly not. Still, every day I write down what happened in a journal, and I send it to my 9-year-old daughter. I see, I said. Well, that's impressive, and that is a lot of writing. What about the second journal? I do the same thing all over again, he said. Write about the day, the events, the things that happened. Maybe interesting, maybe not. That one I send to my 5-year-old daughter. And you write it differently, I take it, for the younger girl, I asked. He raised his eyebrows, obviously. This next passage is really the heart of the reading tonight, and it is set during the lead up to the first graduation for a college and prison program in New York, after the complete collapse, or well, let's be honest, destruction of college and prison programs that followed the 1995 Omnibus Crime Bill. That was something of a cause of controversy, if you remember, in our most recent presidential campaign. This was the first law signed by the Clinton administration after the Republican takeover of the House under Newt Gingrich. And one of the things this crime bill did to fight crime was shut down every college and prison program in the country by making people in prison ineligible for Pell Grant funding. And we started growing the project at Bard in the aftermath of that really massive destruction, which was a partnership, just to be clear. College and prison was a partnership between colleges, public and private, in New York in particular, Catholic universities and colleges and state university systems, and the officials who ran the prisons. When Congress made a pretense of debating this piece of the Omnibus Crime Bill, 96% of the country's wardens came down to testify against the revocation of Pell eligibility. 96% of the men and women who run the prisons across the 50 states, and they begged Congress not to do this. I can explain the details of their testimony if anyone's interested later. Anyway, so this program came up in the aftermath of that, and as a result, we were operating in a very hostile executive in New York at the time, and a very indifferent national climate in the sort of height of the getting tough era that next week's reader historian will be speaking about. And so the first graduation was a very nerve-wracking event, right? Because it was a public event. It was a public affairs or opportunity for the college, which desperately needed to raise money for this program. And running a program in semi-secret and trying to raise money for it in our country is a very bad combination. And so we were reaching a point where we were going to take this opportunity to really seek exposure rather than to live in the shadows, and a critical moment for our students who, should we be shut down because of this risk of making a public event around this college and prison program, they would be the ones to lose their lifeline to everything that the college had come to mean for them. So everybody was very on edge. And the heart of these barred graduation ceremonies in prisons are the graduate speakers. The graduating cohort will, amongst itself, decide on 3 of themselves to represent the group with speeches. There's no valedictorian speech. There's an election by the group of their own 3 graduate speakers. They draft their speeches, and my job at this first graduation was to act as their speech-making coach, you could say, their public speaking coach, their mentor, and potentially their censor. They're also, hands tail. So I'll read a scene from one of these exchanges that I had with a student who's drafting his speech for his upcoming graduation inside this prison, and it's the first of its kind in quite a while. Right. Joseph could be intellectually vain, but never arrogant. His well-earned self-regard had nothing to do with establishing the superiority of himself over others. On the contrary, he enjoyed giving and watching any good intellectual performance. Socially sensitive, he was a delicate participant in classrooms often full of less experienced students. At some point, he had begun to mentor a number of other men in the college who became his friends. He encouraged and tutors those not yet admitted, but keen to get in. More importantly, he would identify students he and others thought could do it and were selecting themselves out of the application process to begin with. He often convinced those, etc. He spent many hours on his own work, but could often be seen tutoring others in math or helping them revise a text of their own. I was very much looking forward to reading his draft. And then I read through the speech he handed me. I was shocked, and then disappointed and bored. The speech he had drafted was about transformation in prison, and it compared the process to that caterpillars undergo as they turn from a chrysalis to a butterfly. In other words, it was just about what most conventional audiences would expect and hope for a student in prison to write. It was a flattering celebration of the rehabilitative effects of college and prison. Even worse, it was rambling and dull. Joseph's distinctive voice, his intensely rational but elliptical and complex, was conspicuously absent. How was I to respond graciously to such a piece of writing? I scanned it, looking for a phrase with some promise, something from which he might push off and try again. And there, floating in the draft, was a passing reference to something called fetes, perpetual fetes. These, he had written, were 18th century American festivals that he had studied in a class taught by Myra Armstead, a professor of American history at Bard. I tentatively suggested to Joseph that his piece was a bit too predictable and with a few too many familiar images. I mean, Joseph, is there a metaphor as endemic inside prisons as transformation? He nodded with his eyes fixed on me, but said nothing. Okay, so what do you think about beginning a revision with this stuff here, I said, on page 3, this reference to Myra's class. That's interesting. He looked at me again and said nothing. Okay, I pushed him further and he said, I wrote another speech, but I put it aside. He pointed to the draft I held in my hand. This was my alternative. I thought it might be considered more appropriate. I looked back at him, tried to measure his poker face, or I should say mirror his poker face. Considered more appropriate by whom? By me? He shrugged, said nothing. Joseph, I said, I'm here to worry about the best interests of the college, looking out for us. Why don't you share with me a copy of the speech you really want to give, the one you really like? Do you remember, he asked, the incident with Mr. Schmidt? I did remember the incident with Mr. Schmidt. It had been one of those charged moments that flared up in the prison day like a brush fire. Most of them go out. Many of them blow up. They are rarely discussed and typically slip into the day's oblivion. A couple of months earlier, time had run out in a class I was teaching, and we were moving from the classroom to the college's general-purpose library room across the hall. The education supervisor's office was the room next door. That means a state prison, employee. Several students and I were continuing our class conversation, running beyond the allotted time and carrying on outside the assigned space. We were milling about on the threshold between the prison hallway and the college classroom. Fraternizing in the halls was against the rules. Mr. Schmidt was thus exposed to something from which he was usually insulated. The scene of our students, his inmates, talking skillfully and passionate with a college professor about the course. "What's this?" he sneered jovially. "The new street corner?" Students fell silent. And without thinking, responding in the same jovial tone, I said quickly, "No, not the new street corner. It's the new agora." Agora, the Greek Athenian public space of philosophical debate and commerce. I recalled the incident and I said, "Yes, Joseph, I do. I remember the exchange." "Well, that's what I wanted to write about for my talk," he said. I was interested in what he said and about what is this, the new street corner? And I was also interested in your answer, Daniel. "No, the new agora." At first, I liked your answer, of course. I mean, I knew what he was getting at, and the whole moment there at the threshold of class, spilling into the hall where we're not supposed to be hanging out together. And I knew that you were getting at, too, when you answered back. But later I thought to myself, wait a minute. This is two white men, both in positions of power, and what they're doing is talking about us, about me and the other students. And they're naming us, describing what we do, deciding on terms like agora, which is good, and street corner, which is bad. So I wrote this draft. He patted his shirt pocket, the one I'm not going to show you, about how you and Mr. Schmidt were naming us and characterizing what we do when we do our work at the college. And I wrote about the street corner and, he paused, and then he resumed. I really miss my old neighborhood. I miss the Bronx, and I miss the street corner. When we are in here in the college studying, do you know what that is for me? That's the closest I can get back to that old feeling, to that street corner, to what was best about my life back home. And I pictured one of those teachers driving through my old neighborhood in their car, looking through their moving window with the doors locked, seeing a bunch of guys who look like us, who look like me, standing around on the corner. And this person would look at us and say, "You see that? They're probably involved in a transaction." He paused. "And he'd be right," said Joseph. "We almost certainly would be involved in a transaction." Okay. All right, one last closing scene. So this comes from a scene that fortunately doesn't take place inside a prison. This takes place on the campus of Wesleyan University, which back in that time, this is maybe 12 years ago or something, was thinking about starting a college and prison program, and they invited some of us from Bard, and we were on a panel with a man named Eric Waters, and I want to end the book with the scene of him speaking at Wesleyan that day. Eric lives in Brooklyn and is an accomplished novelist and playwright. His first novel, by the way, which came out 2 years ago, is called Streets of Rage. As a teenager at Rikers Island Easy began to read books, escaping into them as he waited for a transfer to a maximum security prison upstate, where he was to spend the next 20 years. He recalled his mother's words then: "You can lose all of your possessions, but in education, nobody can ever take that away from you." I'll just pause and say, I've heard that numerous times from different students. Their moms told them that. I was never told that by my parents encouraging me to pursue an education. As Eric made his way upstate and the years rolled on, he became a serious reader. Already an accomplished autodidact, he entered a college inside the prison back in the day when there was Pell funding and Pell eligibility. He thrived and completed a degree and began all the while to accumulate books. But the prison had rules about how many books an inmate can keep in their cell, 20 at a time. Easy spent more years in prison after completing his BA and then his MA degree, all the while amassing more and more books. Having at first been a vein opened to another world, his books eventually became his world, an alternative architecture around him. And whenever he reached the quota of 20 volumes, he shipped the books back home to his mother in Brooklyn. Eric told of his release, 2 college degrees, and 20 years later, at the age of 36, he returned to his mother's home where she had kept every book. The walls of their small row home were jammed, the basement lined with shelves built for the purpose, overflowing with books. They were the index of his appetite and of his preservation and of the quota inside his cell, 300 miles north. Thousands of volumes packed the house. Overwhelmed upon his return home, Eric wallowed, and after several weeks, something snapped. He woke one morning and in a feverish dream state descended to the basement and filled his arms with books. He began to carry them out of the house and pile them up on the street corner, trip after trip. First, his mother protested. Then she tried to physically restrain him, and finally she watched, resigned, tearful, as he worked ceasefully, silently, the entire day and into the night. And over the course of that endless, frenetic day without words, he moved thousands of volumes by the armful, piling them upon the street corner to be taken away by the occasional passerby or hauled off to the trash. Only then, he said, could he begin to resume his life. Thank you. That's it. That's all I've got for you. So we have some time to talk. Yes, sir. Mr. McNeely from Road.
That was an invitation for questions, so.
Questions? Sure. Okay, great.
The first question is, you left us with the individual who wrote the journals.
Yes.
In the interview.
Yes.
Would you share with us what happened to him after that point? Second question is the notion of rehabilitation. Can you share with us why it is and isn't anathema?
Great. Yes. Thank you. So about the student who writes the journals, he joined the Notre Dame and Holy Cross program at Westville College there. Thrived for about 3 months, and he had been a member of was a member of a white, what you'd call it, supremacist sort of gang, which are very common in the Indiana prisons. And I think they reclaimed him and beat him very badly, he engaged in kind with them, and we lost him from the college. Well, I didn't tell you that part of the story. And then the second question is an abstract question about why the concept of rehabilitation is anathema and not anathema. So thank you for that paradoxical question. It is anathema and not anathema. So one, remember recalling a conversation with a student who had graduated from the college and hadn't been received parole yet, and we were talking about policy. We were having a sort of think tank inside the prison talking about policy, and I shared with them that we were talking about what college in prison does, what the college does in there, and he said, well, one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't change us. He says, it's not the critical factor in our change. He says, I changed, and then I applied to BARD. And I said to him, King, that was his nickname, and I said, King, you understand that if that's true, you're undermining the single most important argument that we out here can make to our state legislatures, as if they listen to rational arguments. They actually don't listen to rational arguments. They do listen for rational arguments that they themselves might be able to repeat. It's a very funny game you do as an advocate, right? I said, you're undermining, the biggest argument for college and prison, that a dose of college leads to a quantifiable amount of reduced criminality. That's the argument we're supposed to make. I said, you're undermining that. He said, okay, I could see that. And I said, well, as I agree with you, but as an advocate, I may be in a place where I have to make, that argument. I did go to law school. My parents sent me to law school for something. So I will make the argument, even though if I agree with you, that it's not entirely accurate. So I think that's both, there is a tendency in this work for us to think that, it's easy to think that what people most need is transformation, right? Whereas what they might need is for the institutions around them to be changed and to align with them differently and better. So I think there is something dangerous about rehabilitation because, like all law, certainly American law, and certainly the criminal justice system, it's very individualistic. The unit of analysis is the individual person, their choices, their bad behavior. It's not even probabilistic. Right, you follow me? It doesn't even say like, well, okay, we all exist in a morally complex world and making difficult choices and leading to consequences, right? But the choices with which we are confronted to make and the consequences of those choices vary enormously, right? So the problem with rehabilitation is that it focuses on the transformation of an individual student who is figured in the imagination in advance to need that, to have a deficit, to have a moral lack. And I think that's a poor way to think about changing criminal justice policy. It's a bad way to think about changing prisons. And it's a terrible state of mind for a teacher. Right? If the teacher begins with the premise that the first day of class, your room is filled with a bunch of people who need, to have their morals enlightened by the great books tradition, it is a very poor way to, start talking about people's journals or an economic interpretation of the Constitution. So that's the problem with rehabilitation. What's not problematic is there's some truth to it, meaning, right, we are changed by reading. We are changed by being able to get out of one environment and into another, into a room, imagine that, of other people in the prison who've decided that they want nothing more than to go to college. So, right, that's a self-selecting community. And they're in the room together, and there is merit time. That's one way we reduce prison populations without changing the law, right? You create a merit time regime. So people get a program and they get out a little earlier, which is a really insidious from my point of view, but anything that will make the number smaller is okay, is better than nothing. Right, it saves us from having a conversation about punitiveness, about sentencing, about policing. So we just let them out earlier on the back end, and that lowers population. New York State has lowered its prison population by almost 30%, while crime has been dropping, both property and violent crime. So have Connecticut, so has Colorado, so has Hawaii, so has Michigan. So there are at least 6 states that have had double-digit drops, intentional policy-driven drops in their prison populations, corresponding with equally dramatic drops in crime. So the rehabilitation model is problematic in that it's it's a problematic way to make policy change, and they're bad terms on which to meet and counter a student. Yes, ma'am, and then the gentleman in the back.
When prisons are built for profit, doesn't that change how many people go to prison versus coming out?
I'm afraid not. I don't think. It's tempting for us to think that they do. But when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California and made as his top 3 policy priorities the reduction of the largest prison system in the world, California state system, there wasn't a single private prison in that state. But the most powerful union in that state was not the school teachers. It was the Correctional Officers Union of California. So that's not normally what we mean by a for-profit prison. It was a state system. It's a government, publicly owned system, staffed by state employees with a union. So it's easy for us, again, that's a simplification. It's easy for us to make the boogeyman the for-profit prison, but that accounts for a tiny fraction of mass incarceration.
Do we ever think of changing the program for early childhood education and the lives that people have so that by the time they get old enough to commit a crime, they don't? They have a chance?
This does speak to the sort of rehabilitative model that the problem is a lot of misbehaving people, which is not generally my take. But what I will say is that, do we? I mean, everyone around the country who's trying to destroy what's called the school-to-prison pipeline is. Everybody who's trying desperately to advocate for cutting the number of children in a classroom per teacher in half, which in case it would only be a little bit too big. Reduce the, yes, everybody is. We're all struggling for that. And I just, to follow up, I think, on the implication of your question, this is not an answer for racial segregation and the violence that represents in Milwaukee or New York or Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's not. So, we have serious problems to deal with, whether they're in education or they're in segregation or they're in other things. And I think of this work as more about America's colleges and universities. This is not, for me, primarily a criminal justice intervention, because that, I think, primarily lies elsewhere in policing and sentencing and residential segregation and the geography of poverty and sort of almost enforced poverty. This is about our colleges and universities. I grew up in a small shoe store and went to my local Ivy, in Philadelphia, and then went to a great law school, not far from here, on Pell for college, and I've seen what our great institutions are like, higher education, and they are, the richer they are, and the more prestigious they are, the more risk averse they are, the less willing they are to spend and to take a chance. I have seen it constantly. The more rich, you come to a town and you look for a partner in academics. And, someone asked me a great question a week ago. It was in Vermont. We were in Burlington giving a talk there with some state senators from Vermont. And the great question from the audience was, when you get to a new state, what's the hardest piece of the puzzle? The philanthropy, the prison system, or the colleges? Great question, because the answer is the colleges.
Do you ever go to the importance of public education? I mean, Frank Zeidler was most concerned that we were losing our democracy because we have to have public school, which takes every child, and that's the base of our democracy, and our democracy is the base of our freedom. And that
I don't disagree with most of that, but I will play devil's advocate.
Okay.
You don't ask yourself that question when you get yet another president from the Ivy League or a Supreme Court justice. You don't ask yourself that question. You ask yourself that question where we're dealing with mass population and poverty. Do you ask yourself that and you say, yet another president from the Ivy League? Yet another Supreme Court justice from Yale and Harvard? That's not the first question that comes to one's mind, meaning American higher educational, yes. And when I take as a model of what we should do next, it's the UC system. It's the University of California system. It's the greatest experiment in mass democratic education humankind has ever undertaken. And it is two things: radically democratic and elitist. And what do I mean by it? So that's a whole other conversation we can talk about. But it is not democracy downward, which is what this country specializes in. When we democratize something, we tend to debase it. Instead of democratizing something, what I would call up, which is everybody gets lifted to the luxury, to the standard. That's not what we do. There's a great book on that in the context of punishment by a legal historian who says America's problem with punishment is a Tocquevillian problem. It's democratizing down. It's whenever we truly democratize something, we lower the standard. We don't raise it. That's why we get called elitist. Because guys are doing real analysis instead of the trades. Okay, please, yes. And then, yes.
So can you give some brass tacks, logistical stuff that, like, was there a library? How did you teach classes? What kind of choice was there? What kind of adjustments did you have to make? Sounds like you tried not to do, you wanted to.
Great, that's exactly right, right. So this is, some adjustments we don't make. Expectations, ambition, premises about capacity, who's smart and who isn't, who's brilliant and who isn't, how talent and genius are distributed among quote unquote populations, a word Baldwin early on taught me never to use. That's why you put it in scare quotes. Those are things we don't change. Also the belief in the diversity of content, i.e. the liberal arts. Different courses, different methods, all of them, as long as they're hard, as long as it's difficult. Things we do change, obviously there's structure, there's lack of choice. You take an incoming cohort, you start a program, you have 15 or 20 students, everybody's taking the same darn class. You're starting a program, you might have to start everybody's writing by hand. Today at Bard, we have local area networks. We have dozens and dozens of computers inside the prisons. That each prison library that we built is networked. That means there are 3 terabytes of memory on site. And there's Mathematica, and there's encyclopedias, and people do their math, advanced math scripting and Mathematica, you build to that, So what really the critical things are, remediation is an interesting thing in terms of nuts and bolts, right? We're dealing with students who've dropped out in the 8th or 9th grade and they have a GED, which in New York up until recently was not a hard test to pass. But they need to go to college right away. So we reject sort of standard models of remediation and developmental education, and we mainstream them right into college, which at Bard is first-year seminar. And that's a year of intensive seminar-based, tons of reading, tons of writing, tons of small discussion. At the same time, they have to take a mandatory not-for-credit grammar class. Because as we talk about dialects and code switching in the college is for first-generation students. That's a big issue, it's learning how to code switch. Code switching means one is moving between styles. Let's just say styles of body, styles of clothes, styles of speech, styles of analysis, styles of argument, constantly from one setting to another. We all code switch from home to the office, right? But some of us have to code switch more than others. And so you can imagine that first generation college students are code switching, right? If you're from a household, right? Okay, so as we talk about in the context of code switching and learning standard American English, the collegiate level, there's a scene where this quote comes from in the book. We'll talk with students about languages and dialects. And there's an old story from linguistic anthropology, but you know the difference between a language and a dialect? Does anyone know this line?
Army and Navy.
Sorry?
Language has an army and navy.
Yes, thank you. Did everyone hear that?
No.
Language has an army and a navy.
A language is a dialect. with an Army and a Navy. It's a great line. So we have a linguist in the room. So, there are lots of compromises about choice, lots of compromises, but we grow. That's the determination of the school involved, is to then get to the point where you can offer choice. And as the degrees advance, that challenge is met. In terms of brass tacks, I can really talk to you about it in detail, but it's about sticking to your principles, which have to do with, genius is everywhere, talent is everywhere, capacity comes in many kinds, and that the American idea of an undergraduate liberal arts education is actually a great idea. That is, we defer the application of a career. We defer the question of how you're going to make a living, how you're going to get rich. Don't get a PhD, we know that. We defer those questions until there's an intense exposure through the diversity of a liberal arts curriculum to everything, as much as possible, that the world on the outside and the intellectual projects that go on have to offer, right? What's the difference between studying one single question as an economist or an anthropologist or as an historian? Those are three totally different ways of looking at you look at mass incarceration. You study that three different perspectives, you get three. Students need to see that. At the same time, they're finding out what's inside themselves. The same diversity that we find reflected in the world is inside of us. It's a Humboldt line, since I drove here over on Humboldt Avenue. That's a principle that we stick to. And everything else is instrumental. So again, I was in a meeting with Massachusetts prison officials, we're starting a program at a great little college called Emerson College on a Boston Common, and we're at Concord Correctional Facility. We want to grow the program. And in part, we want to grow it because a woman was recently rejected from Harvard's history department. Actually, she was accepted to Harvard's history department after 15 years in a prison in southern Indiana, in Indianapolis, and got into the department, and then the people upstairs threw out her acceptance. And it created a huge controversy. So now the Harvard faculty are all in it to do, because they have Harvard looks bad again, and the country loves to make Harvard look bad. So then we have a lot of overtures from Harvard faculty to teach in the Emerson College program. So we went to the prison officials. I said, I need more classrooms. I need more space. I want to bring in these great historians. And they said, we can't do it. And we negotiate over the table. You've got to be able to do this. And they said, well, we can't staff the computer lab. And I said, okay, we'll do it with pen and paper. And they said, really? I said, yeah. They said, you mean Emerson College will do a class with Harvard professors and a pen and paper? I said, yeah, if the professors want to teach, they're going to have to read the scribbles on the paper. They said, well, then okay, you can do more classes. So that's a good example. That's really nuts and bolts, is whatever it takes.
Well, my question was about the students again, which is, I think if a movie director were to see this, he would imagine these characters as Goodwill Hunting kind of characters that you presented to us. And I wonder if we're meant to take them that way. And if not, then what that says both about the prison and the general population, and maybe about college.
I'm going to lose a lot of street credibility right now. Can you explain that to me? I have not seen the movie.
Goodwill Hunting, yeah. So the idea is being in Boston.
Okay.
Yeah, so like the idea is that these hidden geniuses who are mopping the floors and figure out, sort of math proofs that have stymied the best minds for decades. Are you, if a movie director were to hear the vignettes here today, you'd be like, you got these hidden gems. But I suspect that's not necessarily the message here. But I'd like to know if it is, and if it's not, what does that say maybe more? What does it say about people in general, people who are sort of open?
That's a great question, right? So, right, as the question is, are we finding these sort of diamonds, in the rough that just happen to be out there, and whatever, that we have some magic recipe for finding the students who, used to not be able to do a line of basic algebra and now do real analysis. That must be, again, this hero story, a Hollywood, I sort of, like struck by lightning kind of story. It's certainly not. Right, that's what I meant to say. The student bodies that get into these programs are demographically identical to the general populations in their prisons. Same race, same ethnicity, same zip code, same prior educational attainment, same lousy schools in the primary schools. And we haven't run out of doing that. I mean, we keep growing bigger and we keep encountering the same bizarre problem. So I think, yes, the question is really, so I think to me it's more about that it's a tragedy. It's not a brilliant story about finding rare talent where you least expect it. It's about a tragic report that there is such an enormous amount of talent all over the place going to waste. That's what it's about. It's about it's not about the finding the rare. It's about encountering how common it is. That's what's outrageous. It's really about how damn common it is for people to be able to be great college students. Look, when we beat Harvard, the Harvard Bard debate team in prison beat Harvard, that you may have seen this last year. And everybody did the Hollywood thing. Except, people who have family who's incarcerated. It doesn't surprise me. My brother's in there, smartest person in our family. He's been there for 20 years. They're not surprised. So again, it's about difference, it's about isolation, it's about insulation. That's some things surprise people, and other things don't. My wife loves to tell a story. He's taught in this program and is in the chair of anthropology at Bard. Students on campus, right? They say, "Well, this really bothers me. This class, it's making me uncomfortable. I don't like it." And guys will apply to the college in prison, and they'll come in and they'll get admitted, and they'll say, "You know what? I found myself getting comfortable in prison, and it scared the hell out of me. And I looked around for a way to get uncomfortable again. So I came to Bard." So it's about insulation. It's about these cognitive dissonances. So yes, it's a great question. And it's about the tragedy and potential of how exciting it is that there's just the talent is everywhere.
We have time for about one more question. Whoa.
Okay, two more, and I will try to answer in 100 words or less, because I talk too much. Yes, sir, here and here. Maybe we'll get
Right.
Please.
Okay. If I go down to the college right down the road here,
Yeah.
there's a defined how many classes of whatnot you need to take. What's your basic program?
60 credits for an AA, 123 for a BA,
Okay.
certain number
They're
of
broken down into
contact hours.
Basic criteria.
That's exactly right. And this could be to that earlier question. We try to hew as closely as possible to contact hours, credit hours, topical diversity. Lab sciences is the last frontier in terms of those requirement questions. Thank you. Yes.
So regarding public schools and Milwaukee public schools, I don't know how much you know about Milwaukee public schools.
Not saying nothing.
Okay. So talking about how bad they could be, or maybe that the children who quote graduate don't know how to read and write, and the illiteracy amount of illiteracy that's going on, and the amount of dropouts that's going on,
Yes.
and all the money that's spent for teachers and for having small classes and everything to try to make it better. How are you going to make it better so that children can actually graduate and be able to read and write?
I'm not going to. What I would suggest we do,
The problem is that the money is not going in the places that it's supposed to be.
this is a great conversation, but to me, any system for funding public schools that's based on property taxes is not public education. It's just not. That's a lie. I reject that out of hand. So,
What do you mean?
this gentleman in the back.
I've taught in Milwaukee Public Schools. The school funding is based on your zip code, your neighborhood, how much money people make in that zip code or that community, and that money is directly funneled into the local schools. Schools are locally funded based on income in their city. So I was educated in a well-to-do white place, and I went to teach in a not well-to-do non-white place, and the money was not there.
Yeah, that's a whole, this is a lifelong project, and we have a lot of people here who know a lot about it, so I'm going to, one last question, and then,
Do you have programs for women?
yes. Every single state we're active in, there are women involved, and about 4% of people in prison in New York are women, and about 20% of Bard students in prison currently incarcerated are women. Yes, and an important,
Different prisons?
yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming this evening. It's great to have you all out. We have books for sale up at the front desk. If you are interested, our author will be signing back here.
An MCM production.